1941, St. Louis, Missouri. The air in Sumner High School's concert hall smelled like floor wax and old sweat, the kind of smell that clings to places where people have been nervous for generations. The single bulb on the wall flickered, throwing shadows that crawled across the ceiling like they were trying to escape. Somewhere in the back room, a 15-year-old boy was wiping his palms on his trousers for the third time in 2 minutes. The clock on the wall read 6:47 p.m. Tick, tick, tick. Each sound louder than the last, each one a countdown to something he couldn't name, something he couldn't stop, something that was coming whether he was ready or not. And that night was when Sumner's rules started getting rewritten. Not by the teachers, not by the principal, but by a crumpled piece of paper in a boy's pocket, and the fire it was about to start. In the corner stood a mirror, its edges dark with age, surface scarred by years of fingerprints from kids checking their ties, fixing their hair, practicing their smiles. Chuck Berry looked into it and saw nothing, just a shadow, just fear wearing his clothes. His chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a belt around his ribs and was pulling it tighter with each breath. Behind him, Tommy Stevens sat on a wooden crate, the borrowed guitar cradled in his lap, fingers wandering silently across the strings. Neither spoke. The tension in that room didn't need words. It had a voice of its own. "You sure about this?" Tommy's voice came out in a whisper, like he was afraid the walls might hear. Chuck didn't answer. His fingers found the paper in his pocket, crumpled, damp with sweat now, the edges soft from being folded and unfolded 100 times. He could feel the grooves where his pencil had pressed too hard on the words. "Baby, here I stand before you." The paper felt like a grenade. Pull the pin and everything changes. 6:53 p.m. The corridor was cold, the kind of cold that seeped through your shoes and settled in your bones. Other students lined up along the backstage hallway, singers of classical songs, piano players, poetry reciters, girls in white blouses with their hair pinned just so, boys in neat ties and polished shoes, all of them safe, all of them approved, all of them exactly what Sumner expected. Chuck moved through them like a ghost. Nobody looked at him, nobody nodded, nobody said his name. He was invisible, the kind of invisible that happens to fourth children in middle-class families, the kind that makes teachers forget your name and girls look right through you. But invisibility, Chuck was learning, could be a weapon. Nobody watched the invisible ones, nobody expected anything from them, and nobody saw them coming. A figure appeared at the end of the corridor, and the temperature dropped 5 degrees. Mrs. Henderson, 50 years old, gray hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, glasses balanced on the tip of her nose. She was the kind of woman who'd never raised her voice in her life because she'd never needed to, the kind who could walk into a room full of screaming children and silence them with nothing but a glance, the kind who'd spent 30 years building walls so high nobody remembered what was on the other side. And then she looked at Chuck. Their eyes met. Her gaze narrowed. Why is this boy sweating? Why are his hands shaking? But she didn't ask. She never asked. She just watched and waited. Chuck kept walking. The paper pressed against his leg, warm now from his body heat, alive almost, waiting. And that's when he knew, really knew, that there was no turning back. 7:04 p.m. The lights went down. The hall fell silent, that particular silence that happens when hundreds of people hold their breath at once. Only the stage remained lit, a single spotlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. The first student walked out, sat at the piano, and began to play Chopin. Notes drifted through the hall like expensive perfume. The teachers sat in front, heads bobbing in approval. This was how it should be. Safe, refined, civilized. But Chuck hadn't come here to be civilized. Tommy appeared at his elbow. "We're fourth." Chuck nodded. His throat had gone dry. He pulled the paper from his pocket, looked at the words one last time. The ink smeared now, barely legible, but it didn't matter. The words had burned themselves into his brain weeks ago. He could still change it. "Swing low, sweet chariot." Nobody would say a word, nobody would remember, but there was a voice inside him, a voice that sounded like Muddy Waters and Jay McShann and every blues record he'd ever pressed his ear against late at night. That voice said, "Go." That voice said, "Now." That voice said, "This is your only chance, boy, and you better take it." He put the paper back in his pocket, and the decision was made. 7:17 p.m. The third performance ended. Applause rolled through the hall, measured, appropriate, the exact right amount. Backstage, Tommy tuned his guitar one last time, fingers trembling on the pegs. Chuck stood beside him, eyes fixed on the crack of light seeping through the curtain. "Last chance," Tommy said, his voice cracked. "We can still change it." Chuck shook his head. "Why this? Why tonight? Why here?" "Because I'm tired," Chuck said, and his voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it, something that had been building for 15 years. "Tired of singing songs that don't mean nothing. Tired of being safe. Blues ain't safe. Blues is true. And tonight, just once, I want to be true too." Tommy looked at him, really looked the way you look at someone when you're seeing them for the first time. And whatever he saw made him nod, made him tighten his grip on the guitar, made him ready. The stage manager appeared in the doorway. "Barry and Stevens, you're up." The curtain parted, light spilled through, and Chuck stepped forward. 7:22 p.m. The stage. The spotlight hit him like a fist, white heat on his face, sweat already prickling at his hairline, the smell of dust burning on the hot bulbs above. For 2 seconds he couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything, couldn't feel anything except his own heartbeat slamming against his ribs like it wanted out. Then his eyes adjusted, and the hall materialized before him. Hundreds of faces, dark skin and white shirts, all turned toward him, all waiting. Mrs. Henderson sat in the front row. Her glasses caught the light and flashed, her lips pressed into that familiar thin line, her hands folded in her lap with fingers interlaced like she was praying, or maybe holding herself back from something. They were watching, but they hadn't judged yet. Tommy found his position behind Chuck. Chuck approached the microphone, an old thing, silver-plated, scratched and dented. He wrapped his fingers around the cold metal and felt something shift inside him, some door opening, some wall coming down. "Hello," he said, and his voice echoed through the hall. "Tonight I'm going to sing a song for you." He didn't say the name, didn't give them time to stop him, just turned to Tommy, gave one sharp nod, and the guitar began to play. 7:23 p.m., the first chord. It hit the room like a rock through a church window, deep, heavy, wrong. Everything about it was wrong for this place, this stage, this night, and that's exactly why it was right. The sound spread through the hall, crawled into corners, climbed up walls, and in the front row, Mrs. Henderson's hand tightened on her program like she was trying to strangle it. Her brows pulled together, her glasses slipped down her nose. She didn't fix them. Chuck opened his mouth, and the blues came out. "Baby, here I stand before you, with my heart in my hand." His voice hit the walls and bounced back, filled every corner of the room like water flooding a basement. This wasn't Chopin. This wasn't safe. This was something else, something raw, something true, something that had been locked up inside him for 15 years. McShann's words poured out of him, words about love and longing, words that had no business in Sumner's auditorium. Mrs. Henderson's face did something complicated, brows pulled together, lips pressed thin, but her eyes were doing something else entirely, something she probably didn't even know she was doing. Her glasses slipped further, and she didn't notice, because for the first time in 30 years, she was hearing something that made her forget about rules. 7:25 p.m., the wave. A girl in the 5th row leaned forward. Dorothy, Chuck's classmate, the one who never looked at him twice. Her eyes were locked on the stage, lips parted, hands gripping her knees. The boy next to her was tapping his foot, not on purpose. His body was just doing it, the rhythm crawling up through the floor and taking control. Chuck moved into the second verse. His voice grew stronger, rising from somewhere deep in his chest, and his body began to move. Shoulders first, then hips, then everything. He hadn't rehearsed this, but his body knew what to do. A boy in the back row stood up, couldn't help it, like the music had reached inside him and pulled. The kid next to him grabbed his sleeve, hissed, "Sit down, fool!" But it was too late, and 2 more kids stood, and then 5, and then 10, and the standing spread like fire through dry grass, and bodies rose, and hands clapped, and feet stomped, and nobody could stop it, and nobody wanted to, and the sound they made wasn't applause yet. It was something more dangerous. Recognition. Mrs. Henderson's face had gone crimson. Her mouth opened like she wanted to stop this, but she didn't move. Couldn't move. Something was holding her there. 7:27 p.m. The peak. Chuck's voice rose and hit the ceiling. The chandeliers trembled. Tommy's guitar answered back, two voices weaving together, separating, colliding, a conversation as old as music itself. Half the audience was on their feet, some swaying, some dancing, some just standing with tears on their faces. Nobody could stop what was happening. He felt it, the connection, the current, the electricity flowing between him and every person in that room. This power, this communion, it was like nothing he'd ever experienced. This was everything. The last chorus came. His voice reached for the ceiling. Tommy hit the final chord, long, trembling, hanging in the air like it didn't want to end. And then, silence. 1 second, 2, 3. The kind of silence that has weight, the kind that presses on your chest, the kind that makes you forget how to breathe. The whole room balanced on a knife's edge. The dust motes froze in the spotlight. The chandeliers forgot to sway. Even the air held still. And Chuck stood there, sweat running down his face, not knowing if he'd just made history or destroyed himself. And then it broke. Applause like a dam bursting, like something held back for years, finally breaking free. It started in the back and rolled forward, picking up speed, until it crashed against the stage and Chuck felt it in his chest, in his teeth, in places he didn't know could feel anything. Encore! 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 In the front row, Mrs. Henderson had risen. She wasn't applauding. Her hands hung at her sides, but her eyes were fixed on Chuck, and something in them had changed. He met her gaze. One long moment. Teacher and student, old world and new. Then Chuck bowed, just slightly, just once, respectful but not beaten, and he walked off the stage. 7:41 p.m. The back room. Chuck collapsed against the wall, legs shaking, lungs burning. Tommy sat on the floor beside him, grinning like he'd just robbed a bank. "You did it," Tommy said. "Sweet Jesus, you actually did it." Chuck couldn't speak. He just breathed. The applause was still echoing in his ears. He reached into his pocket. The paper was still there, soaked through with sweat, but it had done its job. The door opened. Her perfume came into the room before she did. Lavender, the old-fashioned kind. But there was nothing grandmotherly about the way Mrs. Henderson stood in that doorway, filling it up, making the small room feel even smaller. Chuck could smell his own sweat mixing with that lavender, fear and flowers, and he wondered which smell would win. Both boys jumped to their feet. Silence, long, heavy, suffocating. Mrs. Henderson's eyes moved across Chuck's face, reading something there, searching for something she couldn't name, something that reminded her of a feeling she'd buried 30 years ago when she'd chosen safety over fire, rules over music, silence over song. And then she spoke, and her voice was ice on glass. That song. Each word fell like a stone into still water. That song had no business on this stage, no business in this school, no business coming out of a 15-year-old mouth. Chuck's throat closed up. The fire from the stage was gone. Silence stretched out. 1 second, 5, 10. And then something happened to her face. The corner of her mouth twitched just once, just barely, like a muscle memory from long ago, from before she became the rule keeper, the guardian, the wall. It wasn't a smile. It was the ghost of a smile, the echo of one. It lasted half a heartbeat. Then it was gone. "Don't do it again," she said. And she turned, walked out the door, heels clicking against the floor, fading down the corridor, disappearing. Tommy and Chuck looked at each other. No suspension, no expulsion, no punishment at all, just 3 words. Don't do it again. And that applause, that thunderous, world-changing applause, nobody could ever take that back. 8:23 p.m. The street. The December air hit him like cold water, sharp, clean, real. After the heat and the sweat and the fear, this cold felt like forgiveness. Chuck breathed it in deep, felt it burn his lungs, and started walking. His footsteps echoed off the empty sidewalks of the Ville. He pulled the paper from his pocket, stopped under a street lamp, looked at it one last time. The words were almost gone, smeared by sweat, destroyed by folding, but it didn't matter. This paper was his first weapon, his first victory. He folded it carefully, put it back. One day there would be bigger stages, louder crowds, brighter lights, and on every one of those stages, in every one of those spotlights, he would be there. Not invisible anymore, not forgotten, not safe, never again. 45 years later, October 1986, St. Louis. 45 years. That's how long it takes for a crumpled piece of paper to turn yellow, for a 15-year-old's fire to become a 60-year-old's legend. 45 years of stages and cells, of hits and handcuffs, of Maybelline and mugshots, of women who loved him and lawyers who didn't. 45 years, and that paper was still in his pocket. Different pocket, same fire. The backstage of the Fox Theater smelled like history, old velvet, older dust. Chuck Berry stood in front of the mirror, 60 years old now, his hair gray, his face lined with the map of a hard-lived life. But his eyes were exactly the same, some things time can't touch. Tonight was his 60th birthday concert. Keith Richards was out there, Eric Clapton was warming up, the Beatles had covered his songs, NASA had shot Johnny B. Goode into space. All of it started in a high school auditorium with a crumpled piece of paper and a kid who refused to be safe. On the dressing table sat that same paper, yellow now, fragile as an old leaf, words completely gone. He picked it up. For a moment he was back in that corridor, sweating through his shirt, terrified and alive. Mrs. Henderson's almost smile, the roar of the crowd, the cold December air. A knock at the door. "Mr. Berry, 5 minutes." He put the paper in his inside pocket, close to his heart, picked up his guitar. The spotlight found him the moment he stepped on stage. White heat, just like before, just like always. The crowd erupted. Chuck Berry closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, he was 15 again. Sweaty palms, crumpled paper, Mrs. Henderson's almost smile. 15 and terrified, 15 and alive, 15 and about to change everything. He opened his eyes. The spotlight was waiting, and the crowd was waiting, and the world was waiting, just like it had been waiting for 45 years, and it would keep on waiting, because Chuck Berry played on his own time, by his own rules, and the world had learned to live with that. He put his fingers on the strings, and the fire started all over again.